Well, thanks ever so much, Mike, and I know that's given us a lot of food for thought, and I'll try and be brief with my presentation so that we've got plenty of time to explore some of these issues in discussion and questions afterwards. I have to say that one of the things I love about this conference is that it's a real opportunity to be challenged and to be affirmed by people who are kindred spirits. And so I'm hoping, I've brought my project here really because it was very much an experiment, and I'd like you to help me to reflect on that experiment and make sense of it, because I don't often get the opportunity to do that where I work. So where do I work? I work for the Living with Environmental Change Partnership, and we're like the sort of interface between the research funders and the people who use research, government departments mainly, and we're talking about environmental science and observations, but a much wider research constituency, because obviously really big issues such as flooding require different disciplinary knowledge. And by being head of impact, all that means is that one of the jobs I have to do is to help amplify research and make sure that it gets to the people who can really use it, like the decision makers and people in policy departments, so that their policies can be evidence-based. Now, we are making some good inroads, I think, because many of our partners come from organizations like DEC and DEFRA and the Department of Health, and I'm glad there's a lot of Environment Agency people here because we work very closely with the agency. But one of the things that we're very poor at is providing information to business. And when I say providing, it sounds like, you know, it's true. We do, I think there is a lot of expertise in the academic community, and we are still telling information rather than telling stories to engage people. So my experiment is about how we shift from that sort of academic paradigm where we write lots of briefing notes and, you know, hope policy makers and business are going to sit down and have a good read. I mean, we are getting away from just publishing in academic journals, which really, frankly, people don't read unless they're your mama or your PhD students, and turning things into sort of 4-page digests. But I wanted to go a step further and experiment with film to see whether film could be a powerful way of people telling stories that would share insights and be a bit of a call to action. And I really leave you to judge whether that was a good approach. I think there are some real success factors which I'll share with you. And importantly, I want to be able to honestly share my learning with you from this experiment, which was a real shift for me, because I used to, as I said, work in the BBC, TV and radio, and I've always been in charge before, but having to sort of open up and negotiate, you know, what is the story? What is the, you know, what really matters to you? What's your agenda? And find an overlapping agenda was, you know, quite liberating, really. And so I'll show the film, and then I'll talk a little bit about my learning from it, and then maybe we can open it up and you can tell me what you think, and whether you think the power of what the power of a film is in terms of what we've learned through this conference about storytelling and structuring stories and so on. So the film, perhaps I better just say, the film is about flooding. Flooding is, as many of you know, one of the most serious natural hazards on the National Risk Register. Millions and millions of pounds are spent actually on research into flooding and how we manage those risks. But what isn't happening is a lot of that research isn't getting really right down to the ground. And so I wanted this film to show ways that could happen. And we based it in Newcastle because I ran a competition really to get ideas for a film from across the research community, and this was the winning entry. I was actually the prize because we couldn't afford to get a really high-powered production company in, but because I had a bit of experience producing films, I was going to produce it and work with a one-man film crew on the film. So I ended up going up to Newcastle, where they had the most traumatic floods in June last year. And so we made a film so we would time it to coincide with a year on from those floods, and we showed it at the Tyneside Cinema to an invited audience. And yeah, I learnt such a lot from just getting out there into the community and hearing the stories. Even on the train going back from our first recce, we mentioned what we were doing because we had a load of camera kit and stuff, and people on the train were still a year on completely traumatized by what had happened to them. So that emotional power and connection, we knew immediately we had to tap into the film. So the film's called Flood Force, and hopefully, fingers crossed because it's on a DVD, it'll be up now. Yep.
From just a few minutes, it went really, really dark at work, and then all of a sudden the heavens opened and you just could hardly see. It was really black. It was almost like night time.
It was weird. It was like biblical sort of, proportions of flooding.
The water was literally bouncing off the walls. Within a minute, the road just turned into a river.
A colleague in the staff room got a phone call from his wife, who taught in the centre of Newcastle, asking whether the children were safe.
I know they said it was a one-off and it wouldn't happen again for the however many years, but you just don't know with this weather.
My research looks at how heavy rainfall events are changing now, how they've changed over the last 50 years or so in terms of both frequency and intensity over the UK, and how they might change in the future. Data that we've looked at for the UK suggests that already these heavy events are increasing in the winter, and there's some evidence to suggest that they're increasing in the summer as well. We've just got hold of a new data set of the Environment Agency that we've been investigating to look at what's happening to these hourly extremes, and there's some suggestion basically that these events are becoming more frequent.
Can you bring up that cockshaw burn again?
Yeah, this is the latest camera image that we've got from Newtel, so it looks like
in some parts of the Tyneside area, we recorded a storm event that should only occur every 150 years, over 2 inches of rainfall in 2 hours. And really the drainage systems can't cope with that. And with the development that we've had in urban areas, that water has nowhere to go and it runs off into the streets, and it floods people's homes and floods the roads and floods businesses, and people can't get about. And I think we've seen a lot more of that recently over the last few years. Hi, this is Phil Welton, Area-Based Controller in the Environment Agency's incident room. Yeah, just to let you know, we've got a development situation on the Ousburn as well as Hexham at the moment. Yeah, there could be a number of properties affected. We've issued the flood warning for Cockshaw Burn and Hexham and also on the Ousburn.
We can't keep on doing what we've been doing in the past, because that'll just mean digging up more roads, putting in bigger sewers, bigger storage tanks, more cost, more disruption. What we have to try and do is find a way of taking surface water out of it from these very heavy rainfall storms and storing it somewhere else to release back into the water courses naturally, or put it back into our own system, but much slower than it comes in at the moment. We're doing a lot with the university on doing some research which is really interesting on modelling our network better and modelling what happens above the ground, and putting those models together, looking at what happens with climate change and changing weather patterns to say, well, what does that mean for the future?
Over the last several years at Newcastle University, we've developed a very detailed flood model to predict where flooding will happen. The idea is that we can design rainstorms into the model which represent something like the big storms we had here in Newcastle last June, and these models will then tell us which areas will have the deepest flooding, where the runoff will be generated and will end up. The models allow us to not only work out where the problem areas are going to be, these hotspots where we're seeing flooding occurring, they also allow us to show what happens if we take away the impermeable surfaces, the block paving and people's drives, and we can replace that with green space which soaks water into the ground, run the model again and see what difference that makes, where the rainfall soaks into the ground rather than running off onto the surface and causing flooding.
In the Great Park, there's a great example where the surface water runoff is directed towards attenuation ponds. So before that water runs off into the Ousburn, which would cause a flood risk downstream, it's attenuated in some ponds. And what we look for is the development to deliver a reduction in runoff that would have happened before that development occurred. So that development is actually improving the situation downstream. So it's really important that new developments think about this, but also existing developments think about the consequences of their water running off and where that water can go. And if they can do something about that, it's really important that everybody plays their part.
This is the front entrance to the site. The principal road goes through here. The first of the commercial developments is just over there. The first of the residential developments is a little bit further to the south.
So what we have here is the water course, and there are flow control devices which limit the flow to the downstream system. All of the flow from the development site discharges into this wonderful sustainable urban drainage pond, and that stores all of the excess flows up to a 1 in 100-year storm, and that's how we restrict the risk of flooding downstream.
The Ousburn has a particular problem further downstream of development going right up to its boundary, which means that as soon as it overbrings, you're in people's private land. Since creating this, the problem has been eased further down the Ousburn.
It must be about collaborative working, so it has to be about early engagement with developers, but it's also about thinking about the future, so not considering drainage at the very end of the planning process, but very much at the front of it.
We're looking to replicate something at the Great Park whereby we are hoping that the scheme we are looking to do will manage the surface water and manage a lot of the problems that we have on one of our estates, whereby it suffers from river flooding, from overland flow flooding, from incapacity issues in the sewage system, and bring in something which then prevents that from happening in the future. So the creation of something similar to the Great Park, which obviously reduces the impact and hopefully prevents flooding in future. Whilst we cannot say we'll never prevent flooding from happening, I think we all need to work better to do this in future, and that means we must look at the sustainable ways.
If we keep on doing what we've been doing, the costs of doing that service will increase, and those costs are passed on to customers, so it may not be the most cost-effective solution. It will cost businesses more. But more than that, there's a community piece of work here that says that you can do something that enhances the local environment for your own reputation, but in the long run, fundamentally, it comes down to that would be probably a lower cost way of doing it than what we're doing at the moment.
The River Green Centre was intended to be a place that would be a very positive and creative place to work. We're sitting in a room with a green roof above us and a pond just to the left of us, and the water runs off the roof at a slower rate than it would do otherwise. So the likelihood of flooding is reduced because of that, but some of the water that runs off doesn't go straight into drains, it goes into the pond, and the pond is a sort of large holding tank that helps to avoid flooding. I think that water runoff control needs solutions at the macro level and at the micro level, and I think what we've got here is a good micro level solution.
And do you think this is going to be the way forward, not just for future developments, but for, I suppose, retrospectively going back and thinking?
From our point of view, I guess overall, what we'd like to do, more and more businesses, is talk to us, work with us collaboratively, because we're doing a lot of work with our local stakeholders, not just businesses, but local authorities and the universities, to see where they can contribute, what we can do to work together. Because at the end of the day, this is a community issue that's just going to get more difficult in the future with changing weather patterns.
We have flood events every year, and if you do nothing about them, if you don't prepare yourself for them, then you're just sitting waiting for a problem to happen again.
Did you? Is it? Oh, right. Well, I've been told it's lunchtime, the dreaded L word. But I'll be brief then about some of the lessons. But first of all, I was very nervous when we showed the film to an invited audience of small businesses. I mean, the idea was to prove that it was possible to change the infrastructure, to change the materiality of environment, the way things are built, and even retrospectively to put in, I mean, drainage is not a sexy subject really, is it? But we tried to make it so that people could see there were real things going on the ground. But even so, I was really nervous when we showed it in Tyneside, because I really thought we'd get a lot of skeptical businesses going, well, you know, climate change isn't happening, why would we want to invest in this, because it's just, we aren't going to see this. completely the opposite. It was fantastic. The conversation was completely different. The conversation was about, yeah, we need to do this. How can we do this? And I have to say my game was raised because I went into this, really my primary agenda was trying to prove that UK research was making a big difference, which it is. But I think the lead came from the business. The Northumbrian Water really felt that they wanted to take that film to a new level and use it as a call for action to reach other businesses. And we did get a really good range of businesses, from Nestle to kind of small development businesses, to the event. And I'm really delighted to say that as a result of the relationships formed around the film during the process of making it, and that's a really important learning message for me. It's not about the product. That's a useful product to have, but the real engagement happened in the collaboration to make the film, because in collaborating to make it, people got that sense that they could collaborate to do something within their community, and we had different aspects of that watershed represented. But since then, it has opened up an opportunity for the water company, the guy Les, who was on the film, who is a development manager, to actually get on in there to some really big developments happening in Tyneside and talk about drainage. Sorry, it's just not an interesting subject, but it is, when it makes the difference between your home getting flooded and, you know, just putting in some simple measures in new developments. And the other big coup, I think, was to get a developer together with the local authorities, which we did on location at Newcastle Great Park, which is a very unpopular development. It's a greenfield site development. It's almost like as big as a town being built there, and there was a lot of suspicion about them. But I have to say, the landscape architect who you saw in that had been working on that project most of his life, really. That was his big project, and it was delivering. I mean, I could hardly believe it when both the Environment Agency and Northumbrian Water endorsed the fact that the sort of Teletubbies landscape, which I saw, was actually a working landscape. It was delivering space for water, so it was holding the water back, so it wasn't causing the flooding downstream. And so for me, there are impacts to grow out of that. And one of the difficulties, though, I would say that the other learning I had was the difficulty of finding the shared story initially, because obviously I had my agenda. Northumbrian Water had a better agenda, which was this call to action and trying to demonstrate something could be done. But that also, when you're working with different institutions, there was one point where the guy from Northumbrian Water said to me, "I don't give a stuff about what you're trying to do," which was a bit of a wake-up call for me. And the other thing was that they tried to introduce Dwayne the Drain, because when you work with the water company, they saw the opportunity. Great, a film. Let's pack in all of our sort of customer-focused campaigns into the one film. So I did have to fight really hard to get rid of Dwayne the Drain, even though greasy drains obviously are a problem and they do contribute to flooding. But it's like trying to keep the story really simple. And the other thing I found is that people don't actually think very much in pictures or stories. That was the other really thing, because I'm a very visual person. And so, and trying to get, nail down what the story was. Eventually, I just had to give up trying to sound like I was intelligent. And I just said to everyone, look, from everything I've heard, and that was the other important thing, I had to listen to every party in that film, because they all wanted, more airtime. It's quite simple. Flooding is absolutely terrible and traumatic. It's going to get worse. What can we do about it? Why don't we work together? And that really became the film that everybody felt they could sign up to. And I feel, having watched it again, that there is a congruence there, that we did get all parts of the jigsaw doing their bit, and they felt confident that other people would fill in the bit they couldn't fill in. So there was a lot of trust, I think, that built up through making that film. Sorry, I'm taking up too much of your time, but so some questions.